live long and prosper. So in this video series, I'm going to be talking through the social justice elements of every episode of the original series of Star Trek. The thing that inspired this project was actually a Fox News article which argued that Star Trek has in some way betrayed its traditional commitment to sort of political neutrality or middle ground by embracing progressive politics. In this series, we're going to see that Star Trek has always embraced progressive politics, and it's always been aspirational for social justice in various senses. I am taking a broad perspective on social justice here, so that may include multiple different types of social justice, whether that's racial, whether that's economic, whether that's religious, whether that's abilities, gender and sexuality, anything broadly considered. I will go through every episode. Some of the episodes I will interview fellow Trekkies and talk with them about it. And then below, in the descriptions, I will give you additional information about the episodes, particularly their original air date, who wrote the screenplay, and who directed that episode. I also want to dedicate this series to my dad, Michael Allen Zapkin. He was an OG Trekkie from back in the day, and it was watching the original series with him that I came to love Star Trek. In this video, we're going to talk about the episode Wolf in the Fold. I actually really quite like this episode, even though when I was younger, this episode used to terrify me. Just the concept of this episode I found really, really unsettling. Because I was not always into horror. As a kid, being a kid with a very active imagination lent itself really well to being a reader, did not necessarily lend itself well to sleeping after something like a horror movie, or indeed an episode like Wolf in the Fold. This is one of the episodes written by Robert Bloch. Kevin Wetmore and I talked about this with Cat's Paw. Bloch was a friend of H.P. Lovecraft. He was very into these sort of ideas of like ancient terror, disembodied horror, cosmic, whatever it was. And that comes through in Cat's Paw, that comes through in The Wolf in the Fold, that comes through in the episodes that Bloch tends to write. So what's the premise of Wolf in the Fold? Well, Kirk, McCoy, and Scotty are on this planet, Argalius 2. And Argalius 2 is basically like, hey, hedonism, wine, women, and song, etc., etc. And so they're basically there on this sort of shore leave. They're there to get sort of Scotty recovered from apparently an explosion caused by a woman somehow that threw him into a bulkhead, and he sustained a head injury. And so Scotty is on this planet. He's having some drinks, you know. And basically he's like, hey, here's this belly dancer. I'm gonna go walking in the fog. There's this weird, like, flirting scene where he's like, it's a fine, foggy night. And she's like, yes, it is. And he's like, I bet no one's ever told you about the fog we have in Aberdeen. And she's like, not a word. And he's like, let's go walking in the fog. I don't know, it's a weird flirting scene, but apparently it gets the job done because this woman goes off with Scotty into the foggy night. Shortly after, Kirk and McCoy are off to a different den of vice because the den of vice they were in either wasn't denny enough or vicey enough. When they hear the woman scream, ah! And then they go over toward her. and they find her body lying on the ground, having been stabbed repeatedly. Scotty is there against a wall, bloody knife in his hand, and he's like, I don't remember what just happened. So, this is being investigated by Mr. Hengist, played by John Leidler, I think? Leidler? I can't remember his name exactly. Something like that. He does the voice of Piglet in Winnie the Pooh. So basically, just imagine just imagine Piglet as the prosecutor in the murder case. So he's investigating. He is not an Argalian. He is from Rigel 4. That becomes important later on. So store that in your noggin. He's investigating. The prefect of Argalius shows up, and he's like, hey, my wife is an empath. She can do this crazy, seance thing where she will be able to determine the truth of these events. And everybody's like, okay, that sounds legit. Let's do it. So that's going on. The Enterprise beams down a technician with a psycho tricorder who's going to basically read Scotty's mind and figure out what has happened to him over the past 24 hours. They go into a private room to do the psycho tricorder reading, at which point she gets stabbed to death repeatedly. Scotty is all, again, like, oh, I don't know what happened. How did I get this bloody knife in my hand standing basically over the body of this dead woman? And then they do the seance. The woman, the prefect's wife, Varus is the prefect's wife. Sorry, I think is the wife's name. I can't remember exactly. But she's all like, oh, I sense a presence. There's an ancient evil that feeds on death and terror. Baradas, Keshlak, Rejak, and then the lights go out, and she is stabbed to death. And when the lights come back up, Scotty's she's actually slumped over McCoy, but Scotty's sort of behind her, blood on his hands. And so Scotty is the natural suspect for all of these murders. The Enterprise crew is reasonably certain he hasn't done it, just because that is uncharacteristic of Scott. He doesn't tend to murder people, much less he doesn't tend to murder women by knifing them repeatedly. So they convince Prefect Varus to allow them to go back up to the ship and conduct the investigation there using the ship's computers. Basically, the computers proved that Scotty did not kill Varus's wife and does not remember killing the other two women, which is exactly what he said. They start theorizing that the words that the prefect's wife had said might be significant. Baradas, Keslak, Rejek. But they don't know what they mean. They don't mean anything per se. Spock runs Rejek through through the linguistics bank, and the computer's like, nothing. Doesn't mean anything. And then he has it scan all other banks, and what it comes up with is Red Jack, which was one of the other nicknames for Jack the Ripper. And so based on that, they start theorizing that maybe Jack the Ripper was not a person as such, but was a disembodied entity that feeds on the emotion of fear and terror. And that it could have an incredibly long lifespan, it could travel through space, etc., etc. So they chart this sort of string of murders from London through London in the 1880s, through Shanghai in the 1930s, the Martian colonies, out into space, sort of between Earth and Argalius. They run the terms Baradas and Keshlak through the computer as well, and find that these were other terms for unidentified murderers who killed multiple women with a knife on different planets. Keshlak being a very, very recent one, that the year before had murdered a number of women on Rigel 4. Remember what I told you to store in your memory banks. Mr. Hengist is from Rigel 4. It turns out that the knife that was used in the murders on Argalius is from Rigel 4. And so what we get is this idea that Mr. Hengist is basically being possessed by this entity, which then, when they sort of figure this out, the entity leaves the computer, or leaves Mr. Hengist and goes into the Enterprise computers. And this is the bit that used to really terrify me. You get these crazed laughter and these bizarre threats. I'm gonna I think cut in just a clip of it so you can hear this these insane threats and the laughter of this entity, that this sort of Jack the Ripper entity.
I am without ending. I have existed from the dawn of time, and I shall live beyond its end. I shall feed, and this time I do not need a knife. You will all die horribly, in searing pain.
So, the Enterprise crew does a couple of different things here. One is, of course, they distribute tranquilizer, very strong tranquilizer, to everybody on the Enterprise, and so everybody just gets really loopy. And then Spock puts the computer to work to calculate to the last digit the value of pi, which, as everybody who took high school math or whatever it is knows, pi has no last digits. And so the idea is that the computers would work on that problem to the exclusion of everything else, and it would drive the Jack the Ripper entity out of the computers. So that's basically what happens. That works. It reappears in Mr. Hengist. They manage to tranquilize him, and then they beam him out into space on the widest possible dispersion in an attempt to sort of basically just eviscerate this non-corporeal entity. If they can just sort of scatter its molecules on a wide enough plane, the idea is that eventually this entity that cannot die will sort of die. Whether it works or not, we don't know. We don't ever get a follow-up to Wolf in the Fold. It could be a sort of deal where it's like, all right, this entity continues as disembodied atoms, but those atoms manage to string themselves back together or something, whatever it is. So there's a couple of very obvious ones here. One social justice element, obviously, again, is treatment of women, specifically, in this case, the murder of women, the consistent murder of women. And this is, of course, built out of the Jack the Ripper legend. Not legend, I mean, they were actual murders, but the Jack the Ripper case. The idea of murdering women, I think, is very much a... So what the Enterprise crew sort of theorizes, what Spock says, is that women generate more terror than men. I don't know that there's any real psychological or physiological basis for that. Actually, interestingly enough, women make up the majority of viewers of horror films, according to the numbers. So, maybe not. But there is, I think, culturally, at least in the West, there is something more terrifying about a serial killer who targets women specifically. I mean, you think Psycho with Norman Bates. You think Buffalo Bill in The Silence of the Lambs. There's something more horrifying about a serial killer who targets women. And that's, I think, very deeply rooted in a sort of patriarchal assumption that women need to be protected or that women are weak and frail or all this bullshit. But it nonetheless is an affective component of Western culture, I think. So, we've got that element, that sort of targeting women for violence. And of course, there's also just the real world problem that women very often do face violence. Domestic violence, for instance, is not exclusively by any stretch of the imagination, but very often targeted at women. Sexual violence is very often targeted at women, etc., etc. So in many ways, women are often systematic victims of violence. You got that aspect of it. And I think that's really the driving one here in terms of direct sort of social justice issues. Is just that problem of violence against women and a long history of serial killers who do target women particularly.